Welcome back everyone to another video on CodePulse Dev. So in today's video we are going to be discussing implementation details and context in relation to programming. So we'll begin by talking about what implementation details are, then we'll talk about what are the problems with them today, and then finally the idea of how context can solve some of those problems. So what are implementation details? So let's say we have a package or library or whatever you want to call it called A, and it depends on package B. So the implementation details of the B package are anything that the B package needs to depend on in order to function correctly, but that a user of the B package should not have to worry about. So let's say for the sake of argument we have two implementations of package B. We'll call them B1 and B2. So often we'll have multiple implementations for the same package, and one may be more performant than the other, for example. So let's say B1 is depending on the C package and B2 is depending on the D package. As long as the functionality of B stays the same, A should not have to worry about whether B is using C or D. So this is basically what an implementation detail is. So another example of an implementation detail for the B package would be whether we are in debug mode, and if so we would like to use a log function so that we can of course debug the package. So if this is suddenly added to B, but the functionality of B remains identical, then A should not have to update any of its code to make this change and update to the new version of B. So what are the problems with implementation details? Well, the two problems are that it's not possible to hide them, or it's too complicated to hide them. So in a language such as C++, although I think they might be working on this if I heard correctly, you'll have to define all of your implementation details as part of the API. Now this doesn't necessarily break your code if you are using a package where the implementation details are changed, but nonetheless it isn't something particularly good. But then the second problem is that it's just often too complicated. So if we forget about global variables for a second, how would our package be able to access variables such as are we in debug mode or a logging function without requiring those to be passed into the package as part of the API of the package? It can't really be done very easily. The only real way you can do this is set up your own context management system, and that's why we are talking about context as the solution to this problem at the end of this video, or in a few moments. So what do people do then? Well, they just make those variables as part of the API, and then suddenly any change to implementation details are breaking changes, and if someone else makes their own implementation, it's just not going to be compatible. And then obviously we have the hassle of passing in all those variables that we shouldn't have to worry about. Now there obviously is the other solution, which is to use global variables, and global variables have their own problems too. I have actually just recently made another video on this channel discussing global variables and context. So we talk about the problems with global variables and how context also solves the problem of global variables. So as you'll see, a lot of my videos will all lean towards this idea of context, which I will be talking about, and how it solves a lot of the problems we have today in programming, or at least how I think it should solve if all goes to plan. So now, what is context and how does it solve this problem? So context is very similar to having global variables, except the values can change in different scopes of your application. So in this example we have the root of the program, which runs some code in B, which runs some code in C, which finally runs some code in D, and D wants to see are we in debug mode, and if so, if there's a log function, then we want to call it in certain places. So basically how context works is we set up those variables, is debug and our log function all the way in A, and like global variables they will then be made available in D, without the need to pass it along all the way through to D. And this is perfect for implementation details. You do not want to have to pass it through the API of all your packages. Now the big thing about context is that the values can change depending on different scopes. So if we have the Z or Z package here, and this is running code in both A and X, then if we come all the way down to Y is not going to have access to is debug or log because it was defined in A, and Y is not being ran along the chain from A. Now in this example with a login function, you'll probably define that at the very root and all your code will be able to access it. But there are many situations where you want the values to change across your program in different scopes. So yeah, I think context is a great solution to this problem, and I strongly believe that context should be built into programming languages. And I've wanted to make a programming language, well, for over 5 years anyway, but the last couple of years anyway, I've actually wanted to make a language to actually solve problems, not just for fun. And a built-in context system is definitely something I'd want in my language. Now maybe you could create your own custom context system where you just pass in a context object through the APIs of all your code. So then your code only has this context system as part of the API, but not the specific values inside the context. But chances are you wouldn't be able to get any compile time analysis or anything from that, and it would definitely still be a lot more complicated and a lot more messy having to pass the context object through your program. And then of course the problem is if you're using another package that uses a different context system or doesn't even use a context system, then your code isn't going to really connect well together. So I've already mentioned my idea of how context should work built into a language in my previous video where I discussed global variables and context, and the card is on screen at the top right corner. Just click the I card. But you're probably already familiar if you've ever used React before. They have a context management system built into React, and for example something that you'll often pass through your components would be theme colors or current chosen languages or anything like that, where you shouldn't have to pass it along the entire chain, but just whatever element is using it can just query that variable from the context. So I will first drink a bit of water. So we will end this video by discussing when not to use built-in language context. So really the only reason I think languages should have this built-in context feature is for hiding implementation details. That's the most important thing about it. So you've probably already had a variable in your code before called context, but this is something entirely different than this context idea I want built into my language. You often will have context being passed through your functions, but if that context is heavily part of the API of your function, the API of your package, then yes, definitely you want to keep passing those context objects through your functions. You don't want to be hiding them like you hide implementation details. So the question is then, should languages have built-in support for context that is not for implementation details, for context that is supposed to be part of the API? I don't think it's something that languages should have to worry about. It's something that can be done so easily manually. You just create a struct, or depending on whatever language, an object. It holds your context data and you just pass it into your functions. It's very simple. The reason this has to be done again is for implementation details, when you don't want to have to pass this all through your functions, and when you don't want to create your own custom context system that may be incompatible with other packages that you are using. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, so thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like. Please tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I'm very interested in this topic and I'd love to hear your ideas. And don't forget to drink 3 liters of water a day, and I will hopefully see you again soon.